Good afternoon to everyone. Really great to be here, and thanks so much for including me in the Filecoin orbit launch. It's just really incredible to think that it's been a year that has passed because just so much has happened. So it feels, frankly, like a decade. And so my goal today here is to cover with you all of the incredible things that we have done at the Starling Lab in collaboration with many friends that are here at this talk. And then I want to paint for you a vision of the future as to where we're headed and some of the table stakes about why all this truly matters. So I'll begin with a little bit of a background on the Starling Lab and give you a sense of our framework and how we have created a lab to do this work. And then finally, the opportunity that we see and that we're so excited to collaborate with other people on. So let's start a little bit about the framework. About 3 years ago, I had the good fortune of meeting a variety of people in the Web3 space at the 2018 Web Summit that was hosted by Decentralized Web Summit that was hosted by the Internet Archive. And it was an incredible opportunity to meet folks from all walks of life within the Web3 ecosystem. And I think we truly look back at that time as a fascinating moment when things were really starting to emerge, where the crypto world as we knew it up until that point, which had really dominated the conversation, now here there was a Web3 movement that was starting to create a new type of conversation about how we could use advanced forms of cryptography to reshape the internet. And what dawned on me was that this opportunity at a technical level also had an amazing opportunity to affect what we think of as civics, or the idea of civil society on the internet. And so what we thought over at Stanford and at USC was that we could engage early in this discussion to think about the role of data integrity. And what we meant by that was specifically that we wanted to work with a whole ecosystem of partners to first understand what are the possibilities. So that began with protocol labs and then quickly expanded to a variety of other partners that were in the industry. And our concept was simple. We wanted to understand how we could put together a set of tools and at the same time also principles that could empower organizations to create robust data integrity as you capture, store, and verify information. And so what that meant was that we could put together really a framework that could experiment with open source prototypes and create best practices that we learned basically in the field. And as human rights activists and other folks that were engaged in civil society could really start to tell us from the ground up how we should be thinking about deploying and implementing these technologies. So rather than moving fast and breaking things and trying to really drive adoption as the first priority, our goal was actually completely different. It was really the inverse, which was to think about social impact from the beginning and to establish a set of principles that could guide the ethical and the regenerative approach to creating this type of technology, as opposed to an extractive and breathless approach. So we began by looking at the ways in which we could use data integrity to help different domains. And so the first place we started was with history. And so we chose a vulnerable data set, which is the data set of the USC's Visual History Archive, which comprises 55,000 survivors of genocide's testimony. You can see here on the right that the genocide collections span the early part of the 20th century with the Armenian genocide, all the way up to contemporary crises in Myanmar with mass violence against the Rohingya. This was an incredible opportunity for us to look at how we could take a large data set, so in this case, 4 petabytes worth of information, and decentralize the storage of that information. And so we not only looked at the archive, but we also deployed in the field cameras and new technologies to actually look at new types of documentation for new crises as they were emerging, and also historical testimony that we could take from genocides in the past from the survivors of them from many decades before. And there was an incredible symmetry that occurred in understanding how the stories, sadly, of this type of violence kept on repeating. And certainly it dawned on us how important the work we were doing was, because preserving that history, of course, is the very best way to understand how we could avoid this in the future. So that work has been extensive. We have focused on creating tape storage solutions in the past with the USC Shoah Foundation. And so what we needed to figure out was a way of downloading the information from tape, packaging, putting it into offline files like car files, and then going and automating deal making and at scale, at a 4 petabyte scale. So I have a lot of people to thank in the incredible work that we've done over this year. Certainly the folks at the USC Shoah Foundation who were in the tech department bravely emerged with us into this world, but they were very much supported by incredible folks over at PL who stepped up to help us figure out how to do this. It was literally dozens of people have come forward. And then also the mining community has been, or the storage provider community has been really important in helping us scale from a phase 1 of 81 petabytes to the 4 petabytes of archival quality information. And so we're engaged right now in the process of phase 1 and quickly moving to phase 3. So for folks that are here and interested in working with us, please do get in touch because we have quite a bit of information that we are going to spread, and we want to decentralize this as much as possible to different organizations all around the world. That work also requires us to think about engaging with the Filecoin ecosystem on the roadmap and the types of things that are still needed. So from a human rights perspective, you may not have heard the exact requirements, but let me tell them to you because they might actually be, relatively speaking, familiar. So things like S3 interfaces are still very much needed because that's where a lot of archival data is stored today in clouds that are S3 compliant. There's monitoring infrastructure that's required to figure out how we're going to be able to look at the proofs of space time and ensure that they remain current. Then as different storage opportunities go up and down for malicious or potentially reasonable concerns around and failures, then of course we need to think about repair strategies that will be able to automatically ensure that we have enough replications of the data in the ecosystem. And then finally, there is a really important thing to consider in terms of liquidity. As we are scaling and trying to put many more petabytes of data on the network, we want to make sure that storage providers of all sizes are able to put up the pledges that they need in order to store this information. And that will require them seeking new forms of capital and assistance to get that done. So that's our history program, and it's been really exciting, and we've got brand new programs in the future that we're going to be looking at, and we'll be excited to announce new things in the coming weeks. Let me switch gears to the journalism program. So this here was an incredible journey that we started in March with the 2020 election. So just before the pandemic shut everything down, we were able to go out with Reuters photographers and think about ways in which we could establish a chain of custody in the cameras themselves and then move the proof of the hash, essentially, that's taken at source up to the decentralized cloud. And so there you can see in some of these demos here that we deployed in the field, we were using professional grade cameras and then cryptographically enabled mobile phones to really leverage things like secure enclaves that could do advanced hardware signing of hashes. And then from there, it's pretty incredible. We were able to move things into the actual CMS of the Reuters newswire. And you can see here in this particular example from March, we were able to take that file, and then you can see here, there are hashes that were established at source that are now actually stored in the Reuters CMS. So it was pretty exciting to then take all that information and start to put it onto the decentralized web. And working with Adobe, one of the things we were able to do was go to the next level of decentralization. So here we took files and actually injected into the metadata of the file itself a universe of information so that you could see here, like let's say you're on a website, you could click on this eye and then see information around who took this photograph, when they took it, where they took it, and then also the links back to the decentralized web. So you see here, Filecoin CIDs, IPFS CIDs, et cetera. So that process was really inspiring because it took us then into the fall. And we worked with Reuters to deploy this technology at scale to create an archive called the 78 Days, which cataloged the photos from every day from the election all the way up to the inauguration. Now, certainly there was no way we could have anticipated what happened in those crucial 78 days, but I can tell you how amazing it was to sit there and at the end of this process, at the inauguration, and look back and think about all the incredible photographs that were taken and now sealed into an historical record that we can now very clearly provide a chain of custody for. And that is It was a first for journalism. No one had ever done anything like this, certainly not at scale. And it taught us a lot about the types of requirements that journalists need. So going forward, we're going to be announcing in the next couple of weeks a series of grants to organizations to continue to do this type of incredible work. And when you really think about those 78 days, one probably the clearest message that you can take away from it, frankly, no matter what side of the aisle that you are on, is that the demonization of the media and the work that has been done to undo public trust in the media is having devastating consequences on not just our democracy here in the States, but also abroad. And so working with cryptographic trust and civil society to bring up journalism into what we might think of as Web 3.0's journalism, how could we imagine that new forms of cryptography can help ensure that as we create and rebuild this form of trust, that we can really help journalists protect the vital information that they collect. Last, the law. This is an area that it really stands to reason that this type of technology that we've been working with would have an incredible impact. And so we went directly into one of the most difficult legal situations in the world, which is in Syria. And working with our partners over at Hala Systems, we were trying to figure out ways in which we could authenticate evidence that's part of war crimes proceedings that are ongoing in domestic courts across Europe, and hopefully at some point through international mechanisms. And what they need are photographs and video that are taken by folks all over social media and human rights defenders who are deployed in the field. And we need to find a way to, first of all, preserve that information, because as it is posted on Web2, it's incredibly vulnerable. And then secondly, we need to authenticate that information. So as there are various misinformation campaigns, we can ensure that the information is valid and remains intact. So that allows us to do many things. We can protect witnesses, we can help ensure that there's proper context around imagery, and ultimately can be used by prosecutors to seek justice. But what we found was that actually the most important thing was that we needed to be proactive about addressing the potential manipulation of imagery as it is taken from the field all the way up to the various platforms. And so we identified many ways in which the data was vulnerable. And we identified this gap between the raw footage that exists in the field and also expert witnesses that sit in trial. And we've been pioneering new forms of what we're calling supervisory testimony that can leverage advanced metadata and cryptography, but then actually have a human sit there in the court and provide extensive information about how the best practices were deployed with the collection of this evidence. So that in and of itself is showing you really the importance of what we're doing here, is that we're really helping translate advanced technologies into something that can be very practical and useful. So where does this take us? Well, as an organization, we have a framework and we know that it's been successful in its deployment, but now we really need to think about how we can focus long-term, about how we can take our prototypes and accelerate them further. We can think about our best practices and institutionalizing them through courses and various publications. And finally, looking at directly engaging in a more systematic approach with our in-field work by providing long-term fellowships for folks. And this is what ultimately has resulted in the creation of the Starling Lab, which is supported by both PL as well as the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. We are so proud to be the very first academic research institution that is fully focused on Web3 and the advancement of human rights. Think about that. It's taken a little while, but now we have two major research universities that are supporting this critical effort and this very first. And that will allow us to help us think about rebuilding trust in all the domains that I've spoken about to you here today. In history, law, and journalism, we have extensive programs. We're bringing faculty from across the world to engage around these issues. And so I'll conclude here now with thinking about what is this opportunity? Last year, I came, as I was talking about a lot of the prototypes that we were just starting to work on, I talked about the importance of decentralization and gave an analogy in thinking about how decentralization is really like diversity or biodiversity, which is that the more types of diversity, the more diversity that you have within a system, ultimately the more resilient it is. And that at a technical level makes sense. Biologically, it makes sense. And now we're also starting to see the human consequences of this, that yes, we want a variety of opinions to be able to help create more consensus around the types of values that we want to have in this world, and that those values will then go and shape the technology of the future. And when we think about Web3, in a sense, it's a way of kind of bringing up all of our amazing hopes and our excitement about this opportunity. And we have now a label, and we have a whole community, and we have a technology movement that's become incredibly powerful. It's become profitable, and now really is this moment to reshape the internet. And yet, I am concerned. And I think informing the lab, what we're trying to do is make sure that we're not falling into the euphoria here of the opportunity, but instead trying to shape a much more nuanced and much more responsible conversation. And here's why. I don't see Web3 as the answer, capital T. We've solved it, done, end of history. It's actually just an opportunity. And the closer that we think about this as just a fragile opportunity, the better off we are. Because to me, the naivete around Web2 was by far the most dangerous thing about it. The consequences that we had around Web2 formed because we just put too much pressure on Web2 to solve everything, technically, politically. And so let me give you some consequences and some learnings that we've had just along the way. So think about the mobile phone technology that we've created and how exciting it was for us to find ways of taking metadata to help establish time and place of a photograph. Well, our researchers have found that actually this exact type of information has already been, framework has actually been deployed in North Korea. And there it's used for surveillance, not for authentication of brave work of human rights defenders, but actually as a tool of the government to continually surveil an already oppressed population. Similarly, when you look at open source movements, they're incredible, and we are very dedicated to open source. And yet open source and open access does not necessarily translate to perfect results. Many of the problems of Web2, you can actually trace back to open source technologies. And so clearly it takes continued engagement to make sure that even with open source projects, we have values and we get things right. And finally, inclusion. Open source does not necessarily mean that we have full representation of all the different voices that can actually help contribute, and even more importantly, the ones that are affected by this. So we need to make sure that as we look at the statistics around open source technology development ecosystems, that we take proactive measures to ensure that we can actually have proper inclusion. And finally, if you look at the opportunities around cryptocurrencies and the possibilities for tokens and crypto economies, El Salvador has now been heralded as this amazing moment and landmark, and certainly it's historic. And yet I can trace it and follow the logic around how the most ardent defenders of Bitcoin have been able to make the case about how this is now a way of pushing back against all sorts of economic imperialism that has existed for centuries. We can trace, for instance, like the good neighbor policy from the 30s into the Bretton Woods to things like the currency crisis that existed in Argentina. That case can be made, and I understand that. At the same time, El Salvador is by no means a beacon of human rights. And if the example of in February of 2020, in which the president marched troops into the legislature to get some of his policies enforced, I don't think that that very much bodes well for where we might be headed with enabling an economy and maybe a government structure with a crypto utility. It just means that we need to be very, very careful, that the euphoria, again, is the danger. And finally, we thought about tokens as a way of being able to cross borders and create this new transnational movement. And yet, if we look and we compare to the hashing rates, let's say in China with cryptocurrencies from 2019 to 2021, we're seeing that China was able to successfully eliminate all hashing of Bitcoin and crypto mining. And so when we thought about these movements like such and Web2 that were able to take down dictators, well, we learned really the hard way that putting this idea of, let's say, Facebook as saving humanity was absolutely the wrong approach. And so central bank currencies are, in some respects, in a similar way, could pose similar challenges, especially in a place like China with the social credit system that could be matched with a central bank currency to produce some pretty challenging results. So we at the lab have been thinking about this, and I'll point you to a new blog post that we've been working on, which talks about how we at Web3 can actually get some things right. And hats off to Rebecca McKinnon, one of our fellows, who created an incredible piece that talked about how we need to really rethink our priorities in Web3 about the types of feedback and grievance mechanisms that are going to be important to help elevate this discussion. And so I urge all of us to really think hard about these things and to get involved. So the lab, as excited as we are about this opportunity, we are open-minded and open-hearted. So we'd love to get folks involved. We're hiring in various positions, and we're very excited to collaborate. So thanks again for having me here today. Thanks again for the continued support, and look forward to the next year and all the exciting things to come.